Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you this morning.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
I am doing well.
Good.
Preparing for our conference.
Yes.
And we're going to reintroduce one of our guests at the conference who's been a friend of ours, and that's Jacob Sullum, who's written a lot about the drug war, and now he's been writing a lot about the right to own a weapon. But Jacob is a writer for the Creators Syndicate as well as a editor for Reason Magazine. But we're really excited about him coming to Houston on the 18th. Jacob, welcome to our program today.
Thank you.
Very good. You know, you had an article that I just came across today. I guess it was just published, and that has to do with the title is "The NRA is Right About the Violence Against the Women's Act." You know, one thing that Daniel and I always talked about in Washington on my staff is if you have a title of a bill, the first assumption is it's going to do the opposite. And it looks like if you take away the right of individuals to own guns, husbands, wives, women, maybe it's going to do more danger to the women. Could that be possible? But in the first part of your article, I found a sentence, and I mentioned to Daniel, and he said, yeah, he says, I noticed that too. It's a great sentence. I want to read that because it sets the tone for so much, not just this article, but for everybody who thinks along libertarian lines. And you were talking about a so-called Senator Klobuchar, a former prosecutor, and you quote, sound like an authoritarian demagogue who equates concern about civil liberties with indifference to crime. Demagogue is the right word for her. So congratulations on your article, and congratulations on that sentence that says so much.
Well, thanks. It was just striking to me that the rhetoric from people in the middle or center left on the Democratic side sounds a lot like the rhetoric that you hear from people, right-wingers, who don't care much about civil liberties, see them as an impediment to fighting crime and to ensuring public safety. And maybe the civil liberties that they don't care about are a little bit different, but the reasoning is very much the same. Don't bother me about the Constitution. Don't bother about due process. So in this case, we're talking about new gun control provisions that are included in the House version of the reauthorization bill for the Violence Against Women Act. And now you mentioned the title of the bill, which puts people who are against this version in the position of seeming to be in favor of violence against women, right? Because if you're not against it, if you're not against violence against women, then you must be for it. And so that, of course, is the way the NRA has been portrayed when they objected to some of these gun control provisions. But if you look at their concerns, they are actually quite valid. The provisions that they called attention to it deals with people who are subject to protective orders. Under current law, if you are subject to a protective order, you're not allowed to own a gun, but only if you've had some kind of process in which you can challenge the claims against you. So it's not just based on the bare allegation that you pose a threat, but you go before a judge and you get to say, well, I don't really pose a threat and here's why, and what you said is not actually true, and so on and so forth. So once you've gone through that process and the order has been issued, then you're not allowed to own a gun. This bill, that even if you have not had an opportunity to contest the allegations against you and you're subject to an emergency order or an ex parte order, which does not involve a hearing, you also would not be allowed to own a gun. So that basically it strips people of their Second Amendment rights for it could be a few weeks. It could even be longer than that if the temporary order is renewed without any opportunity to contest the claims against them. So that, I think, should be troubling really to any consistent civil libertarian, because we are talking about a constitutional right, the right to armed self-defense. and not due process. There's no process at all as far as the subject of the order is concerned. So I think anybody, the ACLU, for example, ought to be concerned about a provision like that. The other provision in the bill that the NRA noted expands the categories of misdemeanors that disqualify you from owning a gun. So under current law, there are various violent misdemeanors that fall into the category of domestic violence against a family member, against a spouse, against someone who has produced a child with you. Various people are close to you, and that's considered to be domestic violence, even though it's a misdemeanor, not a felony. This bill would expand those misdemeanors to include nonviolent crimes, specifically crimes that are described as stalking under state law. Now, stalking can be menacing, it can be threatening, it can involve putting somebody in fear that they're going to be injured or killed, but it does not necessarily. So many state laws define stalking based on the emotional distress that it causes. And this could be something like online harassment, which you oftentimes see on Twitter. If you use Twitter at all, you'll see people saying nasty things, targeting other people to the point where the target will just, block that user and not pay attention to them anymore. Similar things happen on Facebook all the time. Now, in one of those situations, it could rise to the level where somebody's actually convicted of stalking under state law, misdemeanor stalking. And at that point, that person under this bill would never again be allowed to own a gun, which seems very disproportionate and indiscriminate to me, because if you engage in this pattern of harassment, let's say, against someone who you may not even have ever met, and you never threaten them with violence, you never do anything that's violent, you can still lose your right to own a gun forever. I'm not going to condone that kind of conduct. I'm not going to say, it may very well be the fact that it should be treated as a crime in certain situations, but it's not the sort of crime that shows you're so violent or you have such violent tendencies that you forever lose your Second Amendment.
Jacob, Daniel, I believe, will have a question for you or a comment.
Yeah, I was just going to close out what you're saying. It sounds like a perfect recipe for someone who wants to seek revenge on someone. Maybe you lost a Twitter battle and you want to really ruin someone's life. That's really chilling, Jacob, and thanks for that article. I also want to thank you in advance, as Dr. Paul indicated, for coming down to join us at our conference in Houston on May 18th, Winning the War on Drugs. And I have to say, just personally, your writings over the years have done a great deal and have been very helpful for me when I struggle with the topic, and you've handled it so masterfully over the years, so we really appreciate your work. And I was just surveying your last couple of months of writing, and I'm pretty envious because you produce a lot, and it's all good. But a couple stood out, and I thought maybe we could talk about them a little bit. The one I really liked recently is The Lingering Stench of Marijuana Prohibition, because we're going to be dealing with the issue to a degree at the conference, but you point out something that, frankly, I hadn't realized, which is that after prohibition of alcohol, the President, FDR, signed a bunch of pardons for people who were convicted of alcohol-related crimes. And now we're seeing this kind of rolling decriminalization, at least of marijuana across the states, but the same thing is not happening. Is that correct?
Yes, not to the same extent. Now, after alcohol prohibition, people thought, okay, here was something we treated as a crime for a while, for a decade and a half or so. We no longer think it's something that should be treated as a crime, and therefore people should not continue to suffer for violating that arbitrary prohibition. In some cases, they are still in prison. In Indiana, the governor actually released people from prison who had been convicted of violating the state alcohol prohibition law. And as you mentioned, FDR issued a whole bunch of pardons to people. And the idea was we can see that this was a mistake. We should not have treated this as a crime. And why should people continue to suffer for that mistake? And the same reasoning, of course, applies to marijuana. People may lose sight of it because prohibition has lasted so long at the federal level since 1937. So when you have something that's gone on that long, people just take it for granted that is a crime. But of course, most Americans now disagree. Most Americans support legalization. Unfortunately, the states, most of the states that have legalized marijuana did not pay much attention to this issue. California is the most conspicuous exception because in their initiative, their ballot initiative legalizing recreational use, they set up a process for expunging people's records. The problem turned out to be that the burden was still on those with marijuana convictions to seek that relief. It could be a complicated process. It can be an expensive process. So California followed up with a bill that was passed last year, which will essentially automatic. The state Department of Public Safety or the Department of Justice rather has to identify cases where what this person did is either no longer a crime or is treated as a less serious offense, so as a misdemeanor instead of a felony, for example. And if prosecutors do not object within a certain period of time, those records will be expunged automatically. No other state has gone that far, and it's too bad because this is really an injustice where people continue to suffer. It's not just the immediate penalty, right? You know, the vast majority of people arrested for marijuana offenses don't spend much time behind bars. There are long-lasting consequences for employment, for education, for getting loans, even for finding housing. I mean, I talked to people with marijuana convictions, nonviolent marijuana offenders, who served their sentence years ago, but they still, you know, may have to go through 20 landlords before they find a place to live. Wow. They may have to go through, you know, a couple dozen different job interviews or job applications before they find somebody who's willing to hire them. And so this is a serious problem that can be addressed at the state level for state offenses. At the federal level, there's a bill that Cory Booker recently introduced that would expunge at least low-level marijuana. There really aren't that many of those, but at least he understands that this is an important issue.
Yes, and you know, Jacob, over the years, I had always had the same position. And I always assumed, well, this is what I believe, and this is what how I vote. And I always assumed it would give me a great deal of political harm and damage and not get reelected. But I was always surprised, early on at least, that it never seemed to hurt me. I live in a Bible Belt, and the people were anti-drugs and all these things, but it never seemed to hurt. And I finally came to the conclusion that maybe the people who have suffered, especially with marijuana arrests and destroyed so many lives, that the people were way ahead of Congress, but I still see that the members of Congress are intimidated and you know, people who are hiring people, they're still scared to death about this. And I always thought over the years, too, that we would win this fight just because prohibition of alcohol was so stupid. They finally said, no more prohibition of alcohol. And I thought there'd be a time that would come where that would happen with drugs. And in a way, we're there. But the way I hear you talk, it's still pretty messy, and we still have a lot of work to do. And I think the only way you can solve this is dealing with it as a principle of liberty rather than saying, hey, I want to be able to smoke marijuana.
Sure, and you know, and the other angle to this is, of course, the conflict between federal and state law, which is ongoing. So you have what are treated as legitimate businesses producing marijuana, selling marijuana in the states where that's legal, but the people who run those businesses are committing federal felonies every day when they open up their businesses. So that's a problem, you know, and obviously it's hard to find a bank that's willing to handle your money because that implicates them in federal crimes. It's hard to get loans. Even filing your taxes, you're not allowed to deduct business expenses, what would business expenses for any other business. That's a tremendous burden if you can't claim those. So there are all sorts of problems at the federal level that need to be cleared up. It's not tenable to have this industry that is legal in 9 states now and still illegal at the federal level.
Okay, well, Jacob, one of the things that we want to try to make as our theme for May, and I know you're going to help us with this, Dr. Paul and I, we're often doing kind of gloomy stories about war and death and destruction. So I'm hoping this is going to be more upbeat conference, and the title is Winning the War on Drugs. And you do tell a few good news stories. So maybe if you can just give us a couple of bright points that we can look forward to when we meet in May.
Well, look, I mean, this is the marijuana legalization is a huge deal. I did not expect to see it so soon. I think what happened is over time, as people became more familiar with marijuana, they realized that a lot of what the government was saying about it was not true. They themselves tried it. They knew people who tried it. Their lives, for the most part, turned out okay anyway. Some of them became presidents. whether that was a good thing or bad thing is another question. But it did not ruin your life. And I think pretty early on, once a widely used drug, most people came to the view that this is not the sort of thing that you should be arrested for. You should not be arrested for using marijuana and put in jail. And then, so if that's true, so using it should not be treated as a crime, then it logically follows that helping people use it should not be treated as a crime either, right? It took a long time for that second part to sort of kick in, but I think you started to see people turn around, especially when the first two states, Colorado and Washington, showed that this could be done. Once there were existing real-world examples that had legalized marijuana and the sky had not fallen, it became much more something that would seem much more realistic. So when you ask people in polls, not just theoretically should marijuana be legalized, but should marijuana be treated the way they treat it in Colorado and Washington? I think that helped turn public opinion around as well. The question is what happens in the future, right? So unfortunately, I don't think we've established a principle that says what you do with your own body is your business and it should not be treated as a crime, as long as you don't violate other people's rights. I think what happened is with this particular drug, people decided that's not that big a deal. It's not the sort of thing that should be treated as a crime. It may not be my cup of tea, but other people should be able to do what they want to. It doesn't necessarily carry over. So that's the future of drug policy reform is going to be focused on how do we take the implicit principle and extend it to other substances that are not nearly as popular.
You know, in the early years when I was defending myself in my district, a lot of people come up and they have a question and say, oh, you're the one that wants to legalize drugs and legalize marijuana, you know, in a negative tone, and inferring the demagogic approach that you want to do it just because you want to use it. And I was able to neutralize that. I had the advantage of being a physician and a father and a grandfather. I don't really like drugs. And when people say you want to legalize drugs, you're the guy who wants to do that. I said, that is not exactly my position. I want to legalize the freedom of choice and legalize the obligation of you making your own decisions for yourself and taking your own risk. And that seems to have helped. So although we talk about legalizing drugs, and you talk a lot about the principle of liberty too, and when you work it into that, it doesn't, I think we neutralize the demagogues to a large degree. Daniel, did you have a final statement?
No, I just wanted to tell our audience that, Jacob Sullum is recognized as probably one of the most important civil libertarian writers, great on the drug war. You're going to look forward to meeting him. You're going to want to hear what he has to say next month, May 18th, in Houston, ronpaulinstitute.org/conference for more information. And Jacob, thanks so much for joining us today and for joining us next month.
Jacob, good to see you today, and we'll see you later.
Thanks a lot. See you later.
Okay.